Hello and welcome to Photography with Imre, and I have been successfully cloned. Well, this is kind of a cool episode because I'm actually redoing my first one. I've always wanted to add a little bit more detail into it and fix up some of those little nitpicky mistakes, and I've also added a whole bunch of graphics and animations that will hopefully clarify this topic even further. So I hope you enjoy Aperture Revisited. The aperture in your lens is basically a hole, and you can adjust the size of the hole to control whether more or less light can get through and onto the camera's sensor. The size, more specifically the diameter, of the aperture can be measured in various units, such as millimeters, but if you think about it, that would not make it very practical for photographers. As you can see in this animation, there could be an infinite number of possible values between having the aperture wide open to close down as far as it will go. In addition, lenses with different focal lengths could complicate things. For example, a 50mm lens with an aperture diameter of 17.9mm lets the same intensity of light fall onto the sensor as a 200mm lens with an aperture diameter of 71.4mm. Yuck! Awful numbers to deal with, and most photographers want to take pictures, not do math. So to reduce the number of headaches photographers must endure, relative aperture sizes are used instead of actual aperture diameters, and this is where the F number comes into play. F numbers are great because they represent fractions of the focal length. Okay, now I just said most photographers don't want to do math, but this is simple stuff and should make this a bit easier to understand. So here's the formula to find the F number. F number equals the focal length divided by the aperture diameter. Perfect. So now I can plug in any F number I want for a lens of whatever focal length, and I can calculate the diameter of the aperture. But wait a second, there's still an issue with this. I mean, I could use almost any value for the F number, which could make things quite difficult when we add shutter speed and sensitivity into the picture to calculate a proper exposure for a photo. But you guessed it, there's another piece to this puzzle. Say hello to the f-stop. F-stops are basically F numbers, but they are arranged into logical steps. As you can see on this diagram, with each step down, the diameter of the aperture is reduced by a factor of 1.4, or the square root of 2, which means that the area of the aperture is half as much compared to the preceding f-stop. This, of course, allows only half as much light through. If we go back up the steps, then each step up allows twice as much light through as the one after it. By the way, the steps you see here are termed full stops. If you've already played around with your camera a little, you'll note that not only do you have full stop settings, but half or even third stops available to you, depending on your camera make and model. This basically provides you with finer control over your exposure. Wonderful! We now have a scale that works beautifully with lenses of virtually any focal length. f4 on a 50mm lens will give you the same luminance on the sensor as a 200mm lens also set to f4. No more worrying about actual diameter sizes. F-stops are also easy to remember and relate nicely to standard shutter speeds. For example, assuming we're shooting the same subject using the same ISO or sensitivity setting, you'll get the same exposure if you shoot with an aperture of f4 at a shutter speed of 1/30th of a second, or at f5.6 at a shutter speed of 1/15th of a second. See what happened? We closed the aperture one full stop, which means a reduction of light by half. But we doubled the time period the shutter is open for, so even though we have half as much light at f5.6 compared to f4, we exposed the sensor for twice as long. Cool, eh? For more examples on this, do check out my blog. Link in the video description and at the end of the video. At this point, you've probably noticed that the size of the aperture plays an important role in determining the proper exposure for a photograph. But the size of that hole also determines how much of your scene will be in focus. In other words, the depth of field is affected by the size of the aperture. When the aperture is wide open, the depth of field is small. When the aperture is closed down, then the depth of field is large. In this next segment, I've taken several photos of a ruler using varying f-stops, starting with the aperture as wide open as it will go on my lens, in this case, f2. Then I kept closing down the aperture until I could go no further, which ends up being f22. The visual aids on the side should also help you understand what's going on, so keep an eye on them. This brings us to this lovely summary and a little gotcha that might confuse some novice photographers. Notice that as the f number increases, the aperture decreases in size. But just remember, f numbers are a fraction of the focal length. Also, lenses with large maximum apertures no smaller than about f2.8 are considered fast lenses. Slow lenses, as you may guess, usually have maximum apertures smaller than f2.8. Fast lenses are generally more desirable as they usually have better quality glass, have a smaller depth of field when wide open, which is useful in some types of photography, think portraits, and in low-light situations, they allow for the use of faster shutter speeds, which can help avoid blurry photos. On the downside, they're usually more expensive. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. Definitely more detailed than the first one. And I will be writing a supplemental blog post, so you can check out the link, as well as Facebook and Twitter links are on there too. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. And I'll hope to see you next time. I'm taking off to look at some black holes. See ya! And as usual, I will be writing a supplemental blog post, so you can check it out there. And check it out there, where? I don't know. As usual, I'll be writing a supplemental post. Take 4. And subscribe, linking all over the place, because you can... Take 5.